Sugar. Oh, honey, honey. Space Coat. Side effects. Space Coat. Side effects. Space Coat. Side effects. Triple dip candy flip. Are you extra technical? Space Coat. Side effects. Triple dip candy flip. Are you extra technical?
Hello again. Welcome back. This is Cal Brigham here with part 2 of the Blood, Sweat, and Tears series. I'm about a month late, and this wasn't an incident of scope creep or losing focus. It was just the scope of the project. I have been working almost continuously on this, and I finally had to just put an artificial stop to it. I need to use my free time for other things, and it's time to put this to bed. One thing to remember is that everything I'm saying should be considered hypertext. My process of writing and note-taking and research has been far more about deciding what to leave out than what to include, because there just isn't enough time. As I said in the first video, this takes years. But I'm going to try and be useful. That is my primary goal. I don't think I can convince the naysayers, because most of them aren't willing to be convinced. I think when people's minds are changed, it's because of their own research and their own willingness to look at the evidence. One thing that's going to happen is I've done an abbreviated version of the citations. I was going to link them to specific things I'll be saying, and also use a more formal citation format. I've abandoned that because it would add another month at least to the project. I have, I think, 8 pages of article references. They are listed by URL, and also each has a heading that briefly summarizes what it talks about. For instance, an article that talks about whether or not exercise results in major weight loss or more than modest weight loss, like more than 5 pounds. To find that article, you would do a search, find on the page search, and put in the word exercise, and it would take you to the articles on that subject. I think that'll work for people who are sincerely interested. And for people who aren't, for people who just want to play gotcha games, nothing would be enough. So I think I've met my goal of being useful. One thing you'll note, about a third of those references are to the NIH, the National Institutes of Health, about a third are to other peer-reviewed medical journals, and about a third are to mainstream magazines. Quite a few also are to the Junk Food Science blog, which is Sandy Swark's blog, which doesn't deal exclusively with fatness issues, but with the low quality of medical research, and especially of journalism around medical issues. And I think the best way to use those citations is to follow my URL to her article, to her blog post, and then follow her links to the peer-reviewed sources. I'll be referring to 2 charts in particular. They're very similar. Both are screenshots. One is from one of the videos by Robert Lustig that you've already seen if you followed the links to the videos I mentioned earlier. The other is similar, and it's from Abigail Sagai, who is a sociologist. And they both basically have the same information, which shows that not all people with metabolic syndrome are thin or fat. Not all fat people have metabolic syndrome. And in fact, the majority of people with metabolic syndrome are thin people. I don't think at any point Robert Lustig fully realizes the implications of that data. And that's a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. It's not news to people in the fat acceptance movement or to people who just know in the deep down that something's wrong with the way this culture sees fat people. But this emphasizes just how insane this situation is. I will be making a series of statements about fatness and fat people. This is probably one of the most controversial sections of this whole discussion. If you want proof, if you want to back it up, consult the sources I've mentioned. First, fat people eat the same amounts and types of foods as thinner people. This has been verified over and over and over. There's nothing special about the way fat people live, other than that it's absolutely unexceptional. Some fat people eat a lot, some fat people don't eat much. Some thin people eat a lot, some thin people don't eat much. Even looking at levels of activity, especially when you take into account that movement for fat people actually requires more energy, there's not even a big difference in the levels of activity. Many people rely on the myth of the lazy fat person to shore up their ego, but there just isn't the data to back it up. Second point, exercise does not cause weight loss. Sorry, folks, but it doesn't. When people who are sedentary become more active, they lose maybe 3 to 5 pounds. And that's it. And it's not just that they swap fat for muscle, although that is part of what's going on. It's just also they don't lose weight. It just doesn't happen. And this has to do with set point mechanisms. The set point is the weight that a person maintains without any special effort. In other words, they eat in response to hunger. They're not binging, they're not starving, they're not dieting, they eat when they're hungry. It is the weight that people stay at even if they're ill. You know, they might lose weight due to having the flu for a week, and then it'll immediately come right back. Set point is primarily determined by genetics. Fat people have fat children. People wind up within 5 pounds of each other when they are identical twins reared separately by parents of different weights. The things that do impact set point are privation, in other words, dieting or starvation. Some illnesses, polycystic ovarian syndrome causes weight gain, AIDS causes weight loss, some forms of cancer cause weight loss, some medications cause weight gain, like Depakote. But basically, it's genes. And no one anywhere has found a way to reset set point other than to raise it. There is a little bit of play in that system, maybe 20 pounds or so. For instance, people can gain or lose within that 20-pound gray area. And in fact, this is the type of weight change that average weight people talk about when they talk about losing weight after Christmas and all that. Basically, they're just making micro adjustments within the set point gray area. And those tiny adjustments have nothing to do with the reality of obesity. The process of losing 5 or 10 pounds has nothing to do with losing 100. They are entirely different situations because of the way the body reacts to maintain weight at the set point level. That's the infamous plateau that dieters talk about. The plateau is nothing unusual. It's perfectly normal. It's the body protecting itself. Weight loss outside the set point gray area can happen through extreme measures, but that weight loss is always temporary. Always means 96, 97, 98, 99% of the time. The important thing is, if you're looking at weight loss data, is to look out for at least 4 years after the so-called weight loss has occurred. Invariably, the weight is regained. Most of the so-called data that you'll see claiming that weight loss is possible doesn't go out any further than about 6 weeks. That it's meaningless. It's absolutely meaningless. One of the things that I found interesting in researching fructose metabolism is that, for instance, you'll look at Dr. Lustig talking about its effect on satiety and people's energy levels, and it makes people into couch potatoes who eat all day. That's really interesting, because that's exactly what happens to dieters or people who are starving. Is the body acts to conserve energy. I'm not sure the significance of this, but I just think it's interesting that one of the things that the intake of high levels or moderate levels of fructose, in other words, fructose that can't be metabolized within the small intestine, the level that goes on to the liver, also mimics the effects of dieting. It turns everybody into dieters who are refeeding, who are starving, or feel like they're starving. Pretty strange. Pretty interesting. No one anywhere knows what happens when fat people are turned into thin people. The reason for this is because it never happens. We're talking about, at the level of populations, fewer than, when you get to about 4 years, it's fewer than 2% of the population. Yes, some people can lose 30 or 40 pounds or whatever it is, but you don't see weight loss that would transform an obese person into a normal weight person, even though that's implied everywhere we turn. People go on and on and on about, obesity, oh my gosh. Well, here's the solution. And the solution turns out to result in weight loss of 5 or 10 or at most 20 pounds. In other words, within the set point gray area. And its impact on obesity is meaningless. Yet it's presented as yet further confirmation that obesity is voluntary, as yet further confirmation that fat people choose to be fat. We're stuck in, one of the reasons we're stuck in this insanity is because the words obese and weight loss are continually redefined to mean different things. And as soon as you challenge the status quo assumptions, the word gets redefined again. Well, I didn't mean that. One bit of data I discovered in this process is, in fact, that sugared beverage intake is not strongly correlated with fatness. No matter what Robert Lustig says, it is correlated with metabolic syndrome, but when you look at fatness itself, it is not strongly correlated. And there are, I think I've got at least 4 articles on that in the citation. Some more information. The people who are currently labeled overweight have the longest lifespans and the healthiest profiles of any of the weight cohorts. The normals actually fare worse than overweight people. So then the question is, especially since overweight people are also the average, they're the largest part of the bell curve, why isn't that called normal? If that's where the most people are, and that's where people are their, generally speaking, are their healthiest, why are they called abnormal? We're living in Wonderland, folks. Type 2 diabetes is not strongly correlated with fatness. Yes, about 86% of type 2 diabetics are fat people, but 70% of fat people do not now and never will have type 2 diabetes. I'm going to say that again. If you look at all of the fat, obese, overweight people in the world, 70% of those people do not and will never have type 2 diabetes. That means that there is not a direct linear one-to-one correlation between fatness and diabetes. Okay, there is this strange thing that, yes, 86% of people who get diabetes are fat people, but even that's pretty weird, because what's going on with that other 14%? And in fact, it's a very important question, because that 14% of thin diabetics are in deep trouble. Their level of sickness, their rate of amputations and blindness and all of those grievous problems that can accompany type 2 diabetics happen more to the thin diabetics. So the distinction is an important one. Are the fat people doing something right? One theory that I would throw out there is maybe the fact that for fat people, movement always includes a higher anaerobic component. In other words, more weight-bearing activity might help. Weight-bearing activity, weightlifting, in other words, cross-training, that kind of thing, has absolutely been shown to improve insulin sensitivity. So does that mean that the thin diabetics would fare better if they did more free weight, not necessarily free weight, but more weight training, period? I think it's an important question. And in fact, you'll see some of the articles that I've listed actually discuss that idea. They don't necessarily discuss it specifically in terms of the thin diabetics, but they discuss it for everybody. And it looks really likely that despite the aerobics craze that we're still feeling the repercussions from in the 1970s, weight-bearing exercise does us a lot of good. So let's talk about a little bit about the obesity epidemic itself. The actual extent of the epidemic is about 30 pounds of an increase. The entire weight bell curve has shifted up about 30 pounds. It's not even throughout the entire bell curve. The fatter parts of the bell curve have increased a little more. The thinner parts have increased a little less. But basically, the whole thing did a shift. Actually, it would be that way for you guys. Went that way. At the same time, and this is dating from 1960, okay? The average person in the U.S. is 3 inches taller. Also, by the way, obesity is no longer increasing. It's leveled off, and you saw that in the Paul Campos video. The so-called obesity epidemic is, in fact, just a mild increase in weight occurrence. And it has nothing to do with the fact that fat people exist. Fat people have existed since the dawn of time, and Lustig himself, when he's not vacillating back and forth, admits this. At one point in one of his videos, he shows the Venus of Willendorf, who is a very fat woman portrayed in a figurine that dates back to prehistoric times. Weight is distributed on a bell curve in human beings, and fat people have always existed. All that's happened is that bell curve has shifted up a little bit. Another factor impacting the so-called obesity epidemic is the fact that in 1998, weight categories were redefined. That's one of the points where the healthier overweight category was suddenly declared abnormal. There were researchers in the United States who were not happy about this, but they were under severe political pressure from the World Health Organization. And what their motivation is, I have no idea, other than perhaps pure bigotry. At any rate, the science on the obesity epidemic stinks. And if you want more information on that, look at Paul Campos' The Obesity Myth, and many of the other books we'll be discussing. And of course, what's also been going on since 1960 is fat people have been hounded, nagged, blackmailed into continually pursuing weight loss, even though weight loss doesn't exist. And one of the best ways to make people fatter is through weight loss attempts. It's one of the ways to ratchet up the set point. And that alone is more than enough to explain any weight increase in fat people or in women of all sizes, because women are basically perpetually dieting in many cases. So we have all this information about fat people, most of which goes counter to the prevailing mythology. How does it impact fructose metabolism and the way added sugars and their health impacts are being discussed? That's our next section. In this section, I'll be discussing how Robert Lustig in particular serves as an example of the complete chaos with which people approach these issues. Many times I think he means well, but he manages to contradict himself, sometimes in the same paragraph. And many of his decisions just don't make any sense, especially in the selling of his own work. For example, throughout his videos, he talks about diets working or ways of eating working, but he never explains what working means. Is he talking about turning fat people into thin people? Or is he talking about improved blood sugar numbers or overall health parameters? What is he talking about? These are in no particular order again. Another one, he talks at one point, this is about 21 minutes into the Sugar the Bitter Truth video, about a soda tax and how it might do the job. And what job is he talking about? If he's talking about making people thinner to the point of, fighting obesity, of eradicating obesity, it's not going to happen. Because for one thing, soda intake isn't correlated with fatness, and also it wouldn't make enough of a difference to change every obese person into even an overweight person, let alone a so-called normal weight person. And in fact, he says this himself in the Fat Chance video, that limiting sugar intake results in only about a weight loss of 0.8 BMI points. And depending upon the height of the person you're talking about, that's between 4 and 6 pounds. Okay. And this is at 38 minutes into the Fat Chance video. So, my God, why is his book called Fat Chance with the word fat on the cover in great big letters? If limiting added fructose intake does not cause enough weight loss to turn obese people into so-called normal people, why is he talking about eradicating obesity? Why is he talking about the answer to obesity? Why does he talk about beating obesity on the cover of the book? Sometimes he and Tobbs will talk about sugar intake being the truth about fatness. And yet it didn't create fat people. Fat people have always existed, probably in the same sort of bell curve proportions as we see over the past 100 years. And more recently, since the addition of sugar intake to the population, we've seen an increase throughout all weight cohorts. So why are they talking only about the fattest third or the fattest half? At one point, Lustig mentions the Willendorf Venus and talks about the many causes of obesity. And yet, a few moments later, he's talking about hyperinsulinemia as if it is the cause of all fatness. Which is it? Gary Taubes, the video I linked to, at about 26 minutes in, he talks about obesity resulting from the onset of metabolic syndrome, as if there is a one-to-one correlation. But again, what about the majority of people with metabolic syndrome who are not fat? What about the 20% of fat people who are metabolically healthy? In discussing the impact of fructose metabolism on satiety, Lustig talks about how it sort of creates gluttony in people. Okay, but that doesn't explain obesity. That might explain that 30-pound increase along the entire bell curve. It doesn't explain why fat people exist. Later on, about 1 hour and 11 minutes in, he's talking about the importance of exercise, even though at another point he had said that, you can't work off calories through exercise. It's crazy. It's the numbers don't add up. He's right. But then later on, he talks about how obesity is how exercise is an important way to battle obesity. Well, no, it's not. It's a great way to make people healthier. It's a great way to battle metabolic syndrome. Doesn't make people thin. And also, by the way, is he saying that exercise isn't important for thin people, for that thin majority with metabolic syndrome? They can just sit on the couch? Later on, the same thing. This is Sugar the Bitter Truth, an hour and 13 minutes in. He's talking about the importance of fiber as a way of mitigating the speed with which fructose is metabolized. That matters because if you slow down the release into the small intestine, the fructose can be metabolized differently. It doesn't tax the liver. It doesn't go into all those lipogenetic processes in the liver, et cetera, et cetera. Yes, fiber is important. Good stuff. But why only for fat people? Why is it and why is it magically related to all fat people, even the fat people who don't have metabolic syndrome? And again, the thin majority can just, subsist without it, even though they're sicker, or at least as sick as the fat people. It doesn't make any sense. I have a note here about the pictures at 1 hour, 12 minutes in Sugar the Bitter Truth. This is a photograph of a fat child, and a man's belly, and the photo is taken with a lens so that the belly is swollen unnaturally, and it's basically a visual joke. I don't understand, At one point, the guy is talking about how fat kids suffer and how fat people are demonized and blamed for all of the diseases that are actually associated with metabolic syndrome. And the next, he's showing pictures like this. Are we human beings or not? I don't get it. Apparently, there are laws and rules and stuff that require them to black out people's faces, and I really wish those would go away. I would much rather see pictures of fat people with their faces intact and with their names and maybe a biography instead of this um, soulless cadaver pictures. We have another instance of this inconsistency at about 11 minutes into the Fat Chance video, where Lustig actually corrects a question from a woman in the audience. We don't hear exactly what she asks, but apparently it's something to do with obesity. And he says to her, well, no, actually, but we're talking about metabolic syndrome. And I'm sitting here watching this cheering, right? But then why is he continually talking about limiting fructose somehow curing obesity, even though when he himself has said that its impact on weight changes is minimal? Why is his book called Fat Chance at all? Why is the name of the talk Fat Chance? Even when one of the first things he says to people is that fat people have always existed and that there are many, many thin people with metabolic syndrome. Why do we keep coming back to the fatness language? In some of his later videos, where he's discussing potential conflicts of interest, it turns out he has partnered with a company called Slendine, Slendine, as in slender, to provide, I think how he said it was to provide products that help mitigate fructose intake, sugar intake. Okay, but why is it called Slendine? Because they're selling it as a diet substance, whatever the hell it is. It doesn't even exist yet. It's probably in development. But why? Why is it associated with fatness instead of being associated with health? Again, why are fat people, regardless of their health, being targeted? Why are thinner people who are sick being ignored? There's one point where he's showing a picture of an MRI. This is at 50 minutes in on the Fat Chance video, showing how supposedly how a fat person's brain is different, and that has to do with satiety and reward feedback systems, all that jazz. Interesting, but he's not talking about fat people. He's talking about people who are overeating, so to speak. In other words, what I want to know is this person a dieter? How long, how many times has this person gone through cycles of privation? The brains of a fat person who's never been interfered with is going to be quite different from somebody who's been repeatedly starved. He never addresses, despite his frequent targeting of fat people solely, the fact that thin people with metabolic syndrome usually fare far worse than the fat people do. And again, why isn't he talking about that? Why are the people at the heaviest end of the bell curve invisible in these discussions? We're talking about the ducks who never become swans. Over and over, he proves these people aren't guilty, that foods do different things in different bodies, which is also what the set point theory says, only for slightly different reasons. When because I'm part of that cohort, when we do everything right, we remain fat people. And that means we remain guilty. It means we're continually still harassed, harangued, ridiculed, assumed to be lazy, assumed to be guilty, assumed to be non-compliant patients, no matter what we do. Why is he ignoring the reality that virtue is not visible, that healthy lifestyles are not visible? Lustig is very comfortable with speaking of two types of metabolic syndrome. Thinner people who have fat deposits around their internal organs, the TOFI people, and people who are visually fat who also have metabolic syndrome. But what he's ignoring, what he doesn't address, are the metabolically healthy obese. What he's not talking about are different types of fatness. His language meanders around and he speaks about obese people as if there is only one type of us, when in fact there are metabolically healthy obese people, when there are obese people who do not have fat deposited on their bodies in the same way as other people. We are as varied as any other cohort. And yet he doesn't acknowledge us except periodically. An especially important point he doesn't address is the fact that fat people whose weight has stabilized, fat people who are at set point, eat normally. They do exercise. There are fat athletes. So his discussion of couch potatoes and people who are continually hungry because of the lack of leptin and all of those things that do seem to go along with excess sugar intake do not apply in any special way to obese people at their set point level. Fat people at set point do not keep continually gaining weight. Their weight stabilizes. Their energy levels are normal. Their intake is normal. So how can excess fructose always be associated with obesity when in fact these stable obese people exist? His science, his cause and effect, his chains of events just don't hold up because of the sloppiness of his language. I think he's right generally about what goes on with fructose. What he's not correct about is this determination to believe, despite all of the evidence, that limiting added fructose will rid the world of fat people, even though he himself presents arguments against this idea. In addition to the continual inconsistency of their arguments, Lustig and Taub both fail to realize the implications of this issue on the place of fat people in society. Like set point theory, like all of the starvation studies, like the Minnesota twin studies, all of those things that disprove the glutton theory, theirs threatens the status quo as far as fat people are concerned. In Gary Taub's video, toward the end in the Q&A, I think it's actually the last question, a man seems to be obsessed with overconsumption. And Taubes addresses his question literally. What he doesn't realize is this man is grasping desperately onto the need to consider himself superior to fat people. Over and over from naive people, angry people, when these issues come up, you hear the question, so are you saying it's okay to be fat? Yes. It always was okay to be fat. It always will be. Thin people have never been our superiors, ever. And that very statement shakes this culture to its core. Many thinner people, average sized people, cannot make it through the day without at least once telling themselves, at least I'm not a fat person. Many people put off their intrinsic existential fear of death by somehow, deep down, secretly believing that only fat people die. Yes, they're living in denial. If I do everything right, I won't have to be one of the guilty dead people. You see throughout these the discussions in the Lustig and Taubes videos, and in others from people making similar arguments about sugar intake, the ongoing assumption that fat people are not part of the audience. Even though we're somewhere around half of the world, even though this issue directly concerns us, we're not assumed to be anywhere in the room. Just go through the videos and listen to the jokes. And what these people do not understand is that the etiology of disease is impacted as much by bigotry as it is by any science. One of the reasons they keep talking about fat people instead of talking about people with metabolic syndrome is because the rules of bigotry, the rules of discrimination require that fat people remain guilty. Acknowledging the truth about that majority of thin people with metabolic syndrome threatens that belief system. How can fat people continue to be hated if there are thin people who are just as guilty as the fat people are? For this and many other reasons, I don't share Taubes or Lustig's enthusiasm for government-based solutions or initiatives. You see this among some fat activists as well. The focus on basically socialism of increased endowments for the poorer people, that kind of thing. Instead of focusing on research, instead of focusing on the empowerment of individuals. Since 1945, since the Nazi T4 program, since the eugenics of the 20s and 30s in the United States and elsewhere, fat people have had a fairly high degree of power compared to earlier decades. Even though we have been intensely exploited and hated, most of the time, we've had to cooperate with our own destruction. We've had to sign the release before our organs are cut up and maimed and destroyed. We've had to go and get the prescription filled for the poison given to us, supposedly as a weight loss aid. The problem is that this means good patients die. I have no doubt whatsoever that if I had followed doctor's orders throughout my life, if I had not been a bad patient, if I had not been a stone bitch sometimes, I would have been dead long ago, at least 3 times over, by at least 3 different methods. None of this is reflected in Taubes or Lustig's or any of the other people's discussions. How on earth can they expect any fat person to trust the government or to trust the American Medical Association or the researchers when they have been so intent on exploiting and killing us for so long. When the lies they have told about us over and over and over, when the abuse they've heaped on us over and over and over, when the jokes they've told about us, including jokes over the bodies of dead people in medical labs, followed us no matter where we go. And these are the same institutions that Lustig and company are expecting us to trust, to tell the truth about how excess sugar intake impacts people and how it proves that that different calories do different things in different bodies. These are the same institutions that gave us Michelle Obama's hatred campaign against fat children. These are the same people who came up with gastrointestinal mutilation, who came up with fen-phen, who came up with the tapeworms, and all the numerous forms of amphetamines. These are the same people who wired our jaws shut and laughed about it because, those fat people are gluttons. And that's why we have to do this. We've had data proving that fat people are innocent since the 1850s, and yet all of these crimes have occurred. And I'm now supposed to trust these people. And let's tell the truth, even Lustig's affiliation with the Slendine people proves this. If there is any way to suck cash out of the lives and suffering and stigmatization of fat people, it'll happen. Regardless of whether those fat people are the ones who really are sick, regardless of whether or not it hurts us. Same shit, different day. This is one of the reasons the TOFI designation bugs me. Thin on the outside, fat on the inside, right? I crunched the numbers, and according to Lustig's inclusive chart of metabolic syndrome sufferers, 15 to 20 million fat people are innocent of the crime of being ill with metabolic syndrome. And between 50 and 67 million thin people are guilty of that crime. And yet, they won't have their bodies cut up, that majority of guilty thin people. They will not be denied jobs. They will not be denied access to education. They won't have bottles thrown at them as they're walking down the street. They won't have vacuous Hollywood idiots talking on camera about how they are a form of pollution in the world. They will not be denied needed medical care just because they refuse to live on less than 1,000 calories a day. Calling them fat on the inside bothers me. It's an example of what people in the military would call stolen valor. These people haven't earned the right to be called fat. That's a medal they don't deserve. Along with all the concerns about the social status of fat people, I think we must remember that when discussing the implications of added sugar, of excess fructose intake, that we desperately need to improve and protect the social status and legal status of people with type 2 diabetes, of all sizes, of all weights. Again, I don't pick up from Lustig especially that he gets just how much people with type 2 are hated as well. how much of a stigma that disease has become, in part, large part, because of its association with fatness. It's already a wicked, nasty disease. Managing it is tricky and confusing and requires a level of self-knowledge that many people find difficult. It requires a level of assertiveness that many people find difficult. I know that there is language in the ADA that supposedly protects people who are medically ill. I know for a fact it does not apply to fat people, because all of a sudden, even though obesity is supposed to be a disease, when there's a situation where it might benefit us to be considered ill, suddenly that designation of illness disappears and we no longer have ADA protection. Again, yet another example of the words fatness and obesity changing meanings depending upon who's talking and when and what their motives are. And a similar thing happens for people with type 2 diabetes. Most of the time, ADA protections are extended only to people with cancer. That's fantastic. People with cancer need the protections too. But why aren't they extended to people with type 2 diabetes? See footnote, because type 2 diabetes sufferers are guilty of choosing to make themselves ill, so the myth says. And a problem here is that if we do find out that sugar intake is part of the problem, that limiting excess fructose, limiting added sugar, will improve the lives of diabetics. And from what I've seen, I think it's very likely it will. We have to make sure that that doesn't present itself as yet another opportunity to blame people for being ill. So what do we do with all this? Bottom line, throw out the word obesity. And no, I'm not saying that people shouldn't have their weight recorded in a medical chart somewhere as just one of the dipsticks that they check. No, I'm not saying that screening criteria should change a whole lot. We should pretend that fatness doesn't exist. I'm saying that the eradication of obesity should disappear as a goal from public health policy. The truth is, fat people will always exist. Fat people have always existed. And so long as the eradication of fat people is made a goal, discrimination will be enacted against the fattest parts of the population. This time in history, specificity of language is crucial, and this sloppy, casual equivocation where obesity is seen to be equivalent with metabolic syndrome, with illness, with diabetes, with heart disease, is unacceptable. It's crummy science, and it is cruel, destructive behavior on the part of anybody. When I look at Taub's and Lustig's books and some of the other people's, especially Ludwig's, Ludwig has basically sold his soul to the devil. Regardless of how good his science may once have been, he is now, I want to use all sorts of obscenities, but he's sold his soul. He is standing on the street corner, selling himself to the highest bidder, and he doesn't care what he says. He makes claims about sugar metabolism, getting rid of fatness all over the place. And he has no science to back it up, and he doesn't care because he's making money. Man should be ashamed of himself. There are many, many reasons why this is a problem, why putting Fat Chance on the cover of the book in great big ugly panic-stricken letters is a problem. Not only does it encourage discrimination, not only does it change the focus of the problem to something that isn't the problem, it also means that the truth, the powerful truth about excess sugar, about added fructose, gets destroyed. When you're telling people if you do this, it will turn you into a fully human being, and then that doesn't happen, the message gets ignored. It becomes just another diet book. It's just another scam. It's just more snake oil. I don't think it's a scam. I don't think it's snake oil. Okay? When you look at the history of sugar and sugar manufacturing, sugar trade, all of that, it's pretty clear something's wrong. And linking it with mere weight loss turns it into a joke, turns it into a lie. It is very true that limiting added sugar will make people healthier. It will not make them thinner, and that is crucial information. For one thing, when it doesn't work, when it doesn't turn fat people into thin people, it's going to get abandoned, even if it makes people healthier. And we see this all the time. We see it with exercise, which has exactly the same kind of effect. Okay, people becoming more active lose a modest amount of weight, if any at all, but their health vastly improves. And it looks like limiting excess sugar or limiting added sugar will have the same effect. It won't make much difference on weight. It'll greatly improve health. But who cares if it doesn't make you skinny? I'm not so sure that Lustig or Taubes or the world's physicians get just how crucial this question is. Fighting for health, real health, under these circumstances means not only taking on the processed food industries or the USDA's influence on nutritional pyramids or any of that. It also means taking on people who are too weak to get through the day without hating fat people. It means taking on hospital administrators who rely on so-called weight loss surgery to keep their surgery centers in the black. It means taking on the pushers of orlistat or phentermine or topiramate or any of the other legal and illegal forms of amphetamine that get thrown at fat people. For people like Lustig and Taubes and Jason Fung and all the other anti-fat crusaders who are starting to jump on the bandwagon, if you're going to be an ethical human being, if you're going to tell the truth, you need to tell your publishers and your marketing people no. You need to tell them no, you're not going to take my work and turn it into just another diet book. Regardless of what the books say on the inside, turning the outside into a diet book is a lie. Talking about eradicating or battling or taking on or triumphing over obesity when that is not what your story is a lie. Not only do you have to take the risk of being a fatty lover, of siding with the hated fat people, you also have to tell the truth to thin people. And granted, Lustig kind of does this, and it's like the minute he says it, he forgets what he said. But he does kind of do it. But you got to say out loud consistently throughout the entire discussion that the majority of the guilty people, the majority of the people who are wasting the fatherland's almighty healthcare dollars are thin. If you're going to make metabolic syndrome a crime, then thin people are more guilty than fat people. Whether or not you're going to make it a crime is another question. The truth is this culture is about one Twitter post away from calling for the euthanasia of fat people. More specifically, it would probably come as a form of assisted suicide because, of course, fat lives aren't worth living and fatness is incurable. So why not let fat people choose to commit suicide, right? I don't know about you, but I can see it coming. And the fact is, if people are going to snoop around just as they did in the 20s and the 30s, looking for groups of people to declare unfit for life, if you're going to do it, okay, then that means that those thin people who are ill with metabolic syndrome are just as unfit as any fat person. So make room for them in your gas chamber too. So I haven't had more than 10 grams of added sugar a day in a little over 2 months. And despite all the books telling you have to do a cleanse or something when you get off sugar, that's baloney. Granted, I was pretty used to spreading out treats and that kind of thing, but there wasn't any big withdrawal wave. And even if there is, it fades. Everything I've read, it fades out within a couple of weeks. By God, anybody who's quit smoking could handle this in a heartbeat. One thing I noticed, I immediately lost a lot of retained water, which I think is good news because it probably means I'm dealing with less inflammation. I hope that's what it means. I also had a pleasant surprise at the dentist's office where since I hit 50, my blood pressure has been around in the provisional zone, whereas most of my life I've always run in the low normal range. And lo and behold, I had my blood pressure checked at the dentist the other day and it was back in the low normal. So that was a nice surprise. And I can't think of anything else that it's related to. I'm simultaneously grateful that I have this information now because it probably means the last third of my life will be far healthier than it would have been otherwise. And I'm also more than a little bit pissed off because I found out about it only by accident, by researching gout. And because of all the piles of bullshit and the cheesy books with the word fat on the cover and great big ugly panic-stricken type, I may well never have found out about this information. I don't know where the world's going to go with this. I don't know if the added sugar onslaught is going to continue. If it does, fat people will probably continue to be scapegoated for the resulting disease, even though we aren't the only people who get it, who get metabolic syndrome, and we aren't, and all of us don't have it, and not all of us have it. As in any other case, all we can do is be responsible for ourselves. And I'm not going to wait for the ADA or the medical schools or the government to catch up. I'm not going to hold my breath. I'm not going to waste my energy trying to wake them up any more than I have done already all of my life. There's this ugly, yellowed, oxidized veneer of hatred and snark and condescension and fat jokes and greed and corruption all over the medical profession. And by the time those folks get around to getting a fucking clue, most of us will be gone. So in the meantime, I would say take care of yourself. Don't wait for them to catch up, and don't bother waiting for them to give you permission. See you in part 3.
Everybody wants to party.